Hey everybody, welcome to the Uncharted Podcast. Guys, I got a really good one for you today. This is an episode I had so much fun recording. It is with Dan Blumenthal. He is the co-founder and the CEO of Blue River PetCare. And so I started to talk to him today about selling practices and what that's like. And we talk a lot about what it's like specifically with Blue River. But boy, he tells stories about Blue River growing from owning 0 hospitals to 200 hospitals and how they got there. And he is a great storyteller and he's really interesting. And I could have talked to him for hours. I really had to rein myself in. I hope to get him back in the future. But anyway, if you are thinking about selling your practice, this episode is for you. If you are wondering what it's like to have a hospital that transitions from being independently owned to corporate owned, this is just a great general episode of kind of what that process looks like and like what it looks like for the staff. And it's really focused on selling a practice that was independently owned and having the legacy that the owner wanted persist. And that's really what we're talking about here. So anyway, it's a good episode. It's not nuts and bolts selling your practice. That's not what I was trying to do. And that's not what I was really interested in. It was much more about sort of the emotional experience of owners to sell their practice. And then also what does culture look like being passed from independent to corporate structure. And that's what we get into. But I just got to tell you guys, Dan was a great guest. He's really fun. This episode is brought to you and made possible by Blue River PetCare. I hope you'll check it out. It's really a good one. Let's get into it.
And now, the Uncharted Podcast.
And we are back. It's me, Dr. Andy Roark, and my friend Dan Blumenthal. Dan is the co-founder and CEO of Blue River PetCare. And I just started off recording and then we had to stop and take it again because fire engines are going past Dan. So let me start with this. Where are you recording from today?
So we are based in Chicago. We're in our offices here in Chicago and we're actually on the 22nd floor. But funny story, when we started this business, we were, starting on the cheap and Roy and Ferdy and I took space on the 6th floor right next to a train.
Oh yeah.
And I was often on conference calls where I'd be like, wait a minute. And then this train would go by. We had to stop for a little while and then re-engage.
The whole room would shake.
We got going enough that we could get some more professional office space.
Oh, that's funny. I met you back pre-pandemic. I think it was 2018, 2019. And I was in Chicago and you guys were hosting a gathering of leaders there. And so you and I got to talk a little bit then back in the day. Boy, Blue River has come a long way in the 5 years in between then and now. Tell me a little bit, just tell me the story. See, it's fascinating to sit down with someone who's the CEO and also the co-founder of the company, meaning you've been there since the beginning. You've seen this thing grow. Talk to me a little bit just about kind of the nuts and bolts and the growth of Blue River PetCare and how that's happened.
Sure. We started this in 2009 and from the very beginning, we had a vision of what we wanted to be, which is we wanted to buy veterinary hospitals, but we wanted to be different from all the other corporations that are out there and provide a different proposition. That was one to really partner with the veterinarians and help them grow their practices, but give them a lot of medical autonomy to run the practices the way they had done historically. And we thought it was a great idea, but I will tell you, when we started, we had this idea and we were trying to find veterinary hospitals to sell to us. And for the first year, nobody sold to us. So for an entire year, we've got this vision. We believe in this thing. We think it's going to be a different model, but veterinarians as a group are somewhat risk averse. And so it was hard to get the first guys into the boat. And I sort of felt like the guy standing in the rain waiting for the bus. Like, I know the bus is going to come, but I'm getting soaking wet. And if I go inside, I'm going to miss it. So we just, had to hunker down and continue doing what we were doing.
Well, so hold on. I got to unpack. There's a reason I brought you on here, but I'm going to get to that in a second because you've already said something I'm interested in. All right. So 2009. So I graduated from vet school in 2008. We were in a recession, jobs were not plentiful, things like that. Do you think when you started out in 2009, you were also, this is really early. I think a lot of people have, a lot of consolidator action in their mind, but that's only been the last 5 to 10 years. And you're talking 15, years. You were 5-6 years ahead of that sort of real consolidation in the industry. in 2009, one, why was that the time, I guess, for you? And then two, why do you think it was hard to sort of get people to start to come on board? It seems like money would have been tight and there would have been people probably pretty excited to have an exit at that time.
Well, and to be honest with you, so we started in 2008. We didn't get a transaction done until 2009. So it was right in the heart of the recession.
That's terrible timing, Dan. That was terrible timing.
And I will tell you, my dad, who's no longer alive, said to me, "Hey, Daniel, great time to start a business." He's like, "You're right in the heart." And I'm like, "Thanks, Dad. Really appreciate that." Thanks. But I will tell you, it did resonate with our vision, which is the veterinary industry is recession resilient.
Yes.
And the veterinarians we were talking to, we were starting a business in the heart of a recession, but they were doing okay. They weren't growing the way they're growing now or the way they had previously, but they were doing okay. So it was not a bad business to start at that point. Part of the reason, though, we had difficulty getting people to join right away is they were having some, challenging years themselves.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to sell off of, numbers that were not at their peak.
That totally makes sense. So what did you do for a year then, Dan? So you got this company. You're like, I have this vision. I want to get it going. You're like the definition of big hat, no cattle. Like you had you had nothing. What was that like? So first of all, I want to know from a strategy standpoint, how did you kind of manage that? But then also from a personal standpoint, what did your wife say when you went home and she was like, have you got to practice yet? And you're like, no, honey, I don't. What was that like?
It required a lot of internal fortitude and belief in ourselves. And I will say, I think this resonates with all entrepreneurs. The veterinarian who starts his practice out of the box and it's Tuesday and he and his wife are sitting there going, okay, I hope somebody comes today.
Yes.
It has that same pain in the pit of his or her stomach. So we feel that. As an entrepreneur, you have to believe sort of in the face of challenges that would argue against what your belief is.
Yeah.
And so what we did for a year is, and it's a story that's become well known here at Blue River, is, once a week, Ferdy, Roy, and I would sit in a conference room and we'd stuff letters to mail them out to veterinarians. We'd lick the envelopes, we'd stick the stamps on, we'd mail them out, and then we'd wait for a few days and we'd start calling the people who we sent those letters to. And I'll tell you, our mouths were getting dry licking all these envelopes.
Yeah.
And one day, Roy, one of our co-founders, comes in and he has a glue stick. And he's like, we got a glue stick. And I'm like, Roy, we're going to make it. This is a huge technological advance. We can do this in about 10 minutes and then get right on the phone. And so there are challenges, certainly, to starting a business that you don't necessarily anticipate when you have that vision.
Yeah. It reminds me of the Seinfeld episode when George's fiance licks the cheap wedding envelopes until she poisons herself. Terrible. Oh, man, you dodged a bullet there. Okay, so you're getting this up and going. Let's kind of jump ahead to today. So that's where we were in 2009. Tell me about Blue River today. How many practices do you guys have? Where are you geographically located? Things like that.
So today we are over 200 practices in 40 states around the country, largely dog and cat. Primarily dog and cat practices. Yeah. We do a few mixed animal. We have some home euthanasia practices as well.
Wow.
We have some avian and things like that. But for the most part, it's, primary care, general practices, dog and cat. And we're all over the country. And our footprint has expanded a lot over the years. We started out heavily in the Midwest, which is where we're based.
Yeah.
And we, just coincidentally had growth in Texas, in the mid-Atlantic region. And then over the years, frankly, by word of mouth, the vast majority of our sellers are folks who know other people who sold to us. And they hear that that it went well in the transaction with Blue River. And so they come as a referral from another one of our practices.
Yeah.
And actually, one of the pieces of advice I would, strongly give to people who are thinking about selling their practices is check out other people who've sold to that group.
Oh, yeah.
Don't just go by the seat of your pants, and don't just take the 5 names that the consolidator gives you. And what I'm fond of saying is, they'll give you a reference list of 5 folks, but if we own 200 practices and I can't find 5 guys to say something nice about me, there's something seriously wrong.
Yeah.
So as the potential seller, you need to get off the list of references they gave you and get to people from vet school, people in your town. Don't go to the people they've given you. And we had a guy in Texas who called 30 of our practices before he decided to sell to us. So he was calling up everybody. And eventually he said, okay, people say for the most part, pretty good things. I'm ready to go. And I think that is a good thing to do. It requires some discipline, particularly if you're talking to more than one potential buyer.
Yeah, no, I think that's just good. That's good, solid advice. It actually touches on the reason that I wanted to talk with you, Dan. I had an experience recently, and it fit with something that's happened a couple of times. But I had a good friend of mine, and he reached out to me, and he's the retirement age, and he was looking around to sell his practice. And let's be candid with you, I think he felt a huge amount of guilt around selling his practice because he had built this thing over like 35 years. And then he was like, what's going to happen when I give it to somebody else? What's going to happen to my employees? What's going to happen to my legacy? That was a huge deal for him. So that was kind of where he was coming from. Unrelatedly, I talked to someone else who had sold their practice. And I see this a lot. They sold their practice. They sold it at a really high multiple. And I don't think that they had really thought about their own emotional connection to the practice when they sold it. I think that, and again, I'm not trying to throw shade here, but they had looked at what they could get or what they could sell for. And I don't think they really thought about what it's going to be like to see radical changes made to your quote unquote your practice, because it's not your practice anymore, and they were really thrown for a loop and way more affected when that practice changed course and significant changes were made than they thought they would be. And so both of those two experiences are in my mind. And Blue River has this reputation of really being focused on the legacy of the practice. And so as you say, hey, Andy, we've got these small animal practices, but then I got to tell you, I'm actually kind of surprised when you said we've got these mixed animal practices and we've got these in-home euthanasia practices. And I say, wow, Dan, these are not, a lot of times it feels like, you do consolidation, you get practices and you bring them into alignment and, sort of put them into a model. But you guys clearly don't work that way. Let's start back at the beginning. Tell me a bit about that, because it sounds like that's very intentional. It's something you lean into. How did you decide that's what you wanted to do? And then I want to get into actually, what does that actually look like when you're doing it with these 200 hospitals?
Sure. It is very intentional. Each practice we buy is nuanced and unique, and we embrace that uniqueness. So we don't rebrand the practices, but we also don't Blue Riverize them. So they are, even if they weren't rebranded, they run largely the way they run. Some of them have leveraged their techs more than others. Some of them, the veterinarians have different areas of expertise, and we embrace that. So we've bought feline only practices. Mm-hmm. And I always joke with them. We don't go, hey, we've got a great growth idea. Let's bring in dogs. Okay, you're feline only, and it's a very quiet practice. It's a unique culture, and we're going to embrace that. And similarly, the mixed animal ones or the home euthanasia are very different practices, but even our practices that are just dog and cat, and we have some that are very near each other in the same city, you wouldn't walk into those and say, oh, these are both Blue River practices. One, you wouldn't know because we don't rebrand them, but they have different feels. Sometimes they have different clienteles. Some of them are, what characterizes all of them, though, is, and this goes to the point of your friend who was feeling uneasy about selling his practice, it's a good fit with us if it's the seller cares deeply about his practice, his people, his team. If he says, hey, send me a bid, I want to know what your number is, and that's all I'm interested in, it's a marriage, and that's not a good fit for us. It's not a good fit for him. Yeah. And I would recommend there are maybe others he should talk to, but not us. If he's thinking, I want this practice to continue largely the way we've built it over time, I know it's going to evolve and you guys are going to have ideas. A lot of those ideas are locally driven. They're not dictated by Blue River. We embrace the ideas that the local team has, but the ways that they're going to grow the practice are the way they have historically. It's developmentally as opposed to shocking the system with change. Oh. And it is by design, in part because early on we recognized that these veterinarians who've built these practices, they've never really worked for anybody else. They just started it the way we started Blue River. They kind of made it up as they went, and now this is how they do it. And their clients have come to appreciate that. Their team has come to appreciate that. The veterinarians have. And so that's the value we're buying. And it would be crazy for us to come in and say, okay, well, that's how you've done it, but this is how we're going to do it going forward. Although I will say many other groups do exactly that. Yeah. They pay a big number for somebody's practice and then they change everything. And I've never understood that.
So if I'm my friend and I say, hey, got this practice, I'm really invested in it, I care a lot about what it looks like going forward after I depart. Dan, talk to me a little bit about what a good onboarding process would look like. And so if I am that guy and I have found a partner who's going to do a good job of sort of bringing the practice in and sort of keeping it to this vision that I had. What should I expect as I come on board?
Great question. And I will tell you, we've built what I think is a first-class integrations group whose entire job is to bring that practice on board. Many of the other groups out there buy the practice. It gets announced to the staff the day it's closed, and, the chips fall where they may. And I think there are some problems that can evolve from that. From our perspective, what we do is when we come to an agreement with a seller on a practice and a sale, we then have a town hall meeting where we come out and we meet with the entire team. We bring in lunch, close the practice for a couple hours and tell them about who we are and answer their questions. And I will tell you, sometimes they're a little shy about asking the questions. So I will often throw out questions like say, hey, you should be asking me, Dan, you're not a vet. What are you going to do with this practice? Yeah. Or what happens if our business declines? Are you going to fire people? Are you going to cut our salaries? How will you react to these things? And what are your resources that you're bringing to bear to help us? So sometimes we get the question.
Yeah.
But sometimes we don't. And I'm like, if I were you sitting there, technician or vet, I would want to know who these guys from Chicago are and why they're doing this and what their plan is. So we have a meeting of the minds early on with not just the seller, but the team that this is going to be, a good thing for the practice.
Well, first of all, I love that transparency. I think that's fantastic. I love that you throw out questions at the beginning because honestly, I think from most veterinarians, like vet techs aren't walking around wondering what questions would I ask from a CEO that materialized. And yeah. They've never been through a transition like this. And so they don't have any idea of what's possible or anything. I think it's great to start to give them some ideas of these are the types of questions that other people might ask or questions I think are probably really useful for you guys and sort of get those doors open and going. What are the most common questions that you get from the staff? Well, are there things that you were surprised early on and now you see fairly regularly when you talk to these groups?
It is interesting. So there's two buckets. There's a number of the staff members are really, which is understandable, are very concerned about their own lives.
Sure.
Are they going to get paid the same rate? Are we going to change the hours? Who are they reporting to? Are the folks from Chicago going to decide hiring, firing, promotions, all those things? And we address that very directly and say, your leadership team continues to be your leadership team. Your medical director and practice manager will continue to be the people you report to. And I'm always fond of saying, if you like it now, you're going to like it going forward because there's not somebody from Chicago who's going to come in and say, hey, Susie, you're not doing a good job, or Mary, you're doing great. It's your same team that you report to right now, and they will continue to make hiring, firing, promotion decisions, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And so that's a bunch of questions usually revolve around that, just very much understandably me focused, what's going to happen in my life. And then periodically we get the out of the box, deep thinker who wants to know what's going to happen. Like, why are people buying veterinary hospitals? What is all I hear about this consolidation and roll up? What's the end game for you, Dan? And are you going to go public? What are the efficiencies you're going to get by buying these things? Why is this an attractive industry? So we do get some of those as well. And I like those questions too.
So you acquire a practice, so they come in and you reach an agreement with the practice owner, and they've got things that they care about and stuff like that. Well, Dan, I'm sure that the agreement is not, you will not change anything ever. Like, that can't be true. People get older, they leave, there has to be some things that change. There just has to be. How do you come to understand what is important about the legacy that is there versus things that are just not as important? I hope that makes sense of what I'm saying is, I know the practice owners, they don't care about everything in their practice. But there's certain things or feelings or experiences that really matter to them. How do you start to know what those are?
Sure. Well, and they are all over the board. So I'll tell you a funny story. We bought a practice in San Antonio, Texas. And about 3 months after we bought it, I went down there just to see how things were going. And we brought in lunch and everyone seemed kind of dour. Okay. And after a few minutes, I'm like, what's going on here? And this kennel kid in the back raises his hand and he goes, why'd you get rid of the birthday cakes? And I'm like, what birthday cakes? And he's like, well, before Blue River owned it, whenever it was somebody's birthday, we'd go to the PM and say, we want carrot cake or we want this kind of cake. And she'd get it and we'd have a party. And I'm like, I love birthday cake. I didn't know anything about this. So it turned out the practice manager hated this task. Oh, and so when we bought the practice, she told him Blue River's gotten rid of the birthday cakes. So lo and behold,
hilarious.
at that meeting, the birthday cakes were reinstituted.
That's hilarious.
But that was something that was culturally important. So there's all different cultural things that they're used to. And we go out of our way up front to say, hey, if it's important to you, it's important to us.
Yeah.
And it can be at the Christmas party. It can be, having a float in the 4th of July parade in town. It could be birthday cakes, whatever it is. There's a lot of stuff around the practice that doesn't really have to do with the practice of medicine, but it's why they enjoy being with each other and what they do.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. That's spot on. That's exactly what I'm getting at. It's funny. The birthday cake, it really does matter to some people and some teams. I mean, it symbolizes something much greater than cake. It's not about the cake itself. It's about what it means to that group.
Exactly. So I will tell you a funny story. There was a broker selling a practice in Las Vegas that I was very interested in. And he put together the numbers and he showed me the numbers, and they were much higher than the numbers that I had been looking at. And he says, you need to pay off this amount of profit. And so I cut through it and I said, well, these ad backs don't make sense. He goes, what do you mean? I said, well, this owner brought in lunch every Friday for the whole team. And so this guy added back all the lunches because under Blue River, you're not paying for lunch. And I'm like, no, we are. What do you mean? Like, we're not the guys who are going to come in and say, hey, lunch on Friday is no longer free. So that's an ad back we're not going to take. And so at the end of the day, there were a whole bunch of ad backs like that. But we buy the practices and embrace the culture, which do have some costs in them, but it's what's meaningful for the morale and team and esprit de corps. And we understand that.
When you started out, and so 2009, then you start to sort of acquire these practices. And so you're getting into the game and you're starting to have these practice things. Dan, what were you most surprised by? What was the thing as you took this role and you started to bring these practices in? What was the thing that you were not expecting you had to adjust to?
I would say this. One of the things I was probably most surprised by, when we started out, we spent a lot of time looking at the veterinarians at the practice and less time looking at the practice managers.
Okay.
And what we learned very early on was that an outstanding practice manager is every bit as critical to the success of the practice as the veterinarians. So we were very worried about, hey, we want to make sure we're not losing the veterinarians when we do this transaction. And very quickly we learned we also have to make sure we're not losing the lay staff broadly, but the practice manager plays a very key role in managing that practice and managing those veterinarians. And so partnering with that person was every bit as important as partnering with the veterinarian.
That makes tons of sense. Talk to me a little bit. So in the Blue River model, and you're sort of leaning into the culture that's there, and you're sort of really, but you keep talking about legacy is the term that I hear you guys use a lot. And so bringing this up, as the original practice owner leaves, that seems like a pretty substantial change, especially if this person is the person we talked about before who's leaned in and they've built this. And then when they go away, it seems like there's a pretty substantial void there. How do you navigate that, Dan? Talk to me about that.
Great question. So first of all, I would say in our model, many of the people who choose to sell to us don't just cold turkey take off.
Yeah.
Like they have a contract for some amount of time. And I always say, hey, we want you to be in and around the practice for as long as you're practicing. So some of them take extended vacations to, a warm climate, and then they, work at the practice in the summer. Some, do relief shifts and things, but they kind of hang around the practice. And again, if we're doing it right and it still feels very much like their practice, they want to be around it.
Right.
Having said that, over time, eventually they do transition. And what we've done at Blue River, which I think is really important, is we've built a clinical development group that's made up of veterinarians and technicians. And that group helps train the young vet who is stepping into the role as medical director when that selling veterinarian steps away. Yeah. Because you're right, that's a critical role. And, no one really teaches them how to be the medical director. They've learned how to be a good vet. And so our team helps them make that transition.
So you have like medical director trainers that just work with people who'll be stepping in that role. That's a cool job. That's the job I want. That's a cool job.
You're hired, man.
How great. How great is it to just get other leaders, get leaders up and running, you know what I mean? And you're not their boss. You're just there to grow them and make them successful. I think that's incredible.
And to clarify, those clinical development people also practice, because I think it's important for them for credibility with these other vets that they are practicing veterinarians as well. But we have conferences that we bring in the young medical directors to help train them on becoming better medical directors.
Yeah. Honestly, I think your advice about digging deep and talking to people who have sold to a group, if you're thinking about selling to that group, I think that's gold. If you were going to give one more piece of advice to a practice owner who was saying, yeah, legacy is important to me. I'm getting to a place where I'm going to step away for whatever reason. Hey, have you got any words of advice you'd give to me? What would you say?
Sure. I have one that will sound counterintuitive, and many of them resist this, but it's a mistake to resist it.
Okay.
And that is, give your staff credit that they kind of know what's going on. Okay. You're 65 years old. And typically when I talk to the seller, they're like, the staff has no idea I'm thinking about this.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you're 65 years old. They know this is coming. And so don't keep it from them. At the right time, include them in the process.
Yeah.
So they're a part of it, as opposed to feeling like you did, to your friend's point, you did this behind their back.
Yeah.
Like, let them know, hey, I care about you guys. I'm at a stage in my life. I'm thinking seriously about doing this. I'm vetting different groups.
Yeah.
And these are the ones, and I'm going to bring some people in for you to meet. Don't be afraid to give them the benefit of the doubt that they'll help you make the right decision, as opposed to putting all that burden on yourself and probably making them feel disenfranchised in the decision. And I'll say selfishly, from the transition, which you were asking about, the transition goes much better.
Yeah.
If the staff is on board with, hey, we met Blue River. We really like them. We think this is a good home for us going forward. And we're grownups. We understand you, Dr. Jones, can't do this forever.
Yeah. Okay, so let me take the other side of this and I want to flesh this out a little bit, because I think this is really important, and what you're saying is really interesting. And I definitely understand why people push back or challenge what you're saying. And so I'm going to poke at you a little bit here, because I really want to understand, because it's too important, it's too interesting to me to just brush over. Okay, so the argument for not telling the staff is that if you tell the staff you are thinking about selling, especially selling to a corporate group, the worst case scenario, catastrophizing, you have a revolt and a rebellion, and your doctors leave, and now you're not selling a 5-vet practice, you're selling a 2-vet practice, and it says catastrophic for your ability to sort of sell, because for what you're selling. I think that's the scary justification that people are given for not disclosing this. And I love where your head's at and the transition, and I want my staff to feel informed. But I got to tell you, I would definitely have that fear, especially when other people say it to me. Talk me through the other side of this. Yeah.
Sure. And totally understandable, right? But it's going to come to that point at some point anyway.
Yeah.
At some point, you're going to reach an agreement, and now those veterinarians are going to have to enter into a contract with this group, right? And if you've picked a good group who you have confidence in, who cares about these people, you're going to be able to get to the finish line. If you've picked a group that doesn't care about the people and just put a high dollar number in front of you, it can either fall apart when you tell them you're selling to that group, or it can fall apart further down the road when that group is coming in and trying to sign those people up to contracts. So it's kind of like ripping a Band-Aid off. You're going to have to do it at some point. And I would say, and this goes to being true to yourself and true to your team, if you pick a group that you believe in, and I strongly believe Blue River PetCare is one of those, we'll help you get through that. We'll meet, and I often meet with the associate vets. I talked about the town hall. We'll have a dinner typically with all the veterinarians and work to get them comfortable that, your seller could sell to certain groups, which you may have heard horror stories about. We're not that.
Yeah.
And here's how we will do things. And here's how your life's not going to change. And here's how the practice of medicine is going to evolve, but it's going to evolve based on local leadership, not dictated by Blue River. And having done this 200 times, we get them comfortable with it. And you got to cross the Rubicon at some point. And the longer you wait, I think the worse it is. Which, to Andy, to your point, it doesn't mean don't have the makings of a deal with Blue River first. Hey, I'm thinking about selling. What do you think? Right. Make sure you've got sort of, you're moving down the road, but include them before the end, or it can lead to a difficult situation.
Yeah, I like that. That totally makes sense. I think the idea of how we talk to the staff is critically important. I mean, there is a right way to kind of break the news in a wrong way. And I think timing is less important than how you actually communicate it. If you get down to it,
I'll tell you, Andy, how you communicate, but timing is important too. So typically what we tell them is when you tell the staff, we want to have the town hall meeting pretty quickly after that. Because we have a script for them, how to tell them about it. But we think within a day or two, we want them to get to see that we're like normal folks, who we are, ask us questions. So don't tell the team on a Friday, let them fill their head with parade of horribles over the weekend as they're home with their spouse. And then a week later, the team that you're selling to shows up. Put them pretty tight in time so we can fill in the holes and answer the questions pretty quickly.
Yeah. People start to tell themselves stories and then it's hard to tone them back down. Well, you also touched on the thing I was going to ask you next, which is the idea that you have a script or a way of saying, these are the touch points. That totally makes sense to me. Given our conversation thus far, I was suspecting that you had some sort of support and guidance on how these conversations go.
We do. But it's funny when you say what's changed. When we started, we didn't. Over the years, we've developed a script that sort of knows where the pitfalls are and how to navigate those for the seller who's never done this before. I mean, the challenge about this whole proposition is the vast majority of people sell their practice once and they could make a mistake. We do actually have a couple groups who owned more than one practice and they sold us one. And then years later, they went to sell the second one and they just came right back to us, which I take as a great validation because we don't really in this business have that many repeat sellers because they only get to do it once.
Yeah.
And again, the most important thing I think in this whole thing is to get to know the buyers as people and check them out. I'll tell you, there's a group in Vermont who we ended up partnering with who the selling vet wanted to know how I met my wife and how long I've been married.
Yeah,
I thought it was
important.
I was really important, but it was important because she recognized that this was a relationship and marriages like these kind of relationships have ups and downs. And was I the kind, I met my wife at summer camp and we've been married 36 years. And that was meaningful to her because she felt like, well, in those 36 years, I'm sure it wasn't all, sunshine and roses. You figured out how to keep this rapport in this relationship. And that was important to her. And I thought it was interesting.
Yes, it is. I think that's fascinating. I think people are so interesting. And what they ask you about or what they care about. Like, I love that. I think veterinarians especially are just generally an interesting group of people, but I love when people ask me those types of questions and I go, why is that important to you? And then they tell you, and I don't know. I think that's fantastic. Dan, this has been amazing. If people are interested, if you're a practice owner and you say, I would like to explore this, what's the best way for them to engage with Blue River? Like, I think some people go, how do you start that conversation?
So that's a great question. So they can go to our website and on the website, they can submit data and our business development team will follow up with them. In addition, we will have a booth at Western States in Las Vegas. They can just stroll up and have a discussion with us for sure. They can, reach out to me personally anytime they want. I'm on the website and begin to engage. And I think one of the things I'd say to the sellers is don't be afraid to do it. They feel like, okay, if they call, they're committing to sell. And that isn't the case. They're just beginning a conversation. Many, many of the people that end up joining the Blue River family, and I do think of it as a family, are people we've talked to for 5, 7, 10 years sometimes. And it's a getting to know us process and us getting to know them. We have a practice we just acquired in Massachusetts that Roy, my partner, first met in 2013. Wow. And we closed it this fall. So we've known them for, 11 years at the time we bought it. And so they shouldn't be afraid. A lot of times veterinarians are a little bit afraid to start that conversation. They shouldn't be. It's the beginning of a conversation. It's not a commitment to sell to it.
I love that you call that out. That would be a thing that would definitely bother me, of this idea of, I'm not sure if I want to do this, but I feel like if I say anything, then all of a sudden there's going to be pressure and what if it gets back to the staff and all of these things and you sort of spin it up. And so the sort of permission just to reach out and say, look, let's just talk about it and just, see how it goes. Begin to chat and maybe start a relationship.
Well, and so we are at Western States, and I will tell you, a lot of vets talk to us at Western States because it feels safer, right? If I come to their practice, they're kind of nervous about that. But if we're at Western States and they just stroll up to the booth, it feels, it's like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. When they talk to us and, they go back to their town and maybe nothing happens.
Well, Dan, thanks so much for being here. This has been amazing. I'll put a link to Blue River PetCare's website in the show notes so people can check that out. Hey, I'd love to have you back in the future and talk to you more and listen to some stories. I think what you're doing is fascinating. I love seeing what you've grown. It's really impressive.
Well, thank you, Andy. It's been great talking with you, and I would love to do it again. And we're excited that you're going to come to our annual conference in August.
I will be there.
And we'll look forward to having you there.
Yeah,
it should be fun.
I am super excited. I love coming and talking to. I love to come and talk to groups of medical directors and practice managers and groups like that. Especially, they're all. I won't sing the praises any more than we've heard here, but it's going to be fantastic. I'm excited to get to come and chat with everybody and and just start to work with those practices.
Sounds great. We'll look forward to it. Thank you so much, Andy.
And that's what I got. Guys, I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you, thanks to Dan for being here. Thanks to Blue River PetCare for making the episode possible. If you're at WVC, I hope you'll go stop by and say hello to them. If you are at Blue River PetCare, then I look forward to seeing you guys in August. We'll stop by for the annual meeting and I'll be able to speak there and that will be super fun. And gang, that's what I got for you. Hope everybody's doing well. Take care, gang. I'll talk to you later.